During the workshop today, please feel free to attend to your needs, help yourself. There will be breaks, but if you need to use the restroom or get a drink or something, don't feel confined to your seat. It's not going to bother me if you need to get up and move around. Also, feel free at any point to interrupt with questions or clarifications, or I didn't understand that, or I lost my place, or whatever. This is meant to be more of a dialogue and engagement than just me lecturing at you. But I can get talking, so you might need to hey Eric, pause me. We're going to be here today till roughly 1. We should be maybe done, we might be done a little early depending. But there will be lunch, so we're gonna have a 5-minute break after the first chunk, and then we'll have a 30-minute lunch. At any point in the meantime, of course, you can help yourself to drinks and snacks as we do. Any questions about just sort of flow of the morning before we get going?
Excuse me.
Yeah.
The restrooms are down around the corner.
Restrooms, yeah,
No.
back corner over here for if you're not familiar with the building. Yeah. Great. All right. Let us begin. Good morning, everyone. We're here today to do a workshop on theology and practice of worship. So we're going to talk about how worship functions in a Christian context. There, of course, are other forms of worship, but today we're talking for Christian purposes. And then we're also going to try to get into the practical structure of Christian worship, what Christian worship is like, what the format of it is, and some of the tools and resources we use. The goal of today is for you both to have a better understanding of the what is worship, why worship, as well as to get some idea of how we think about putting worship together, what its components are, and so you just have a better grasp of how the worship functions. And this is hopefully going to be useful for people who may serve in various leadership roles in worship as lectors and readers and speakers at different times, but also just deepen your engagement with worship as a whole. So, worship is a big word that encompasses a lot of different practices and behaviors. It's an ancient human thing, way before human writing, way before the advent of the religion which became Judaism and Christianity. It is spread in every culture and every community all over human society. It is all over the place, and it looks in many different ways. Worship, it comes from the concept or same root words as worthiness, to be worth something, to be valuable. To worship something is to say that thing is worthy of or valued by you enough that it's worth this behavior of admiration, praise, obeisance, sacrifice, giving, all sorts of behaviors that fit in this category of worshipping this thing which you hold to be worthy, the thing which you hold to be of value. In a Christian or Jewish context, of course, we're referring to God as the thing, the object of worship, the thing which we're saying is worthy of worship. But there's, worship, full behavior can be ascribed to other things too, right? People worship all sorts of things in all sorts of ways. and so what we mean by how worship functions is a little bit, we're trying to tease out this behavior and what it means to Christians and how it functions in a Christian context. Christianity and Judaism came up in the context of the late Bronze Age, a period in time in the ancient Near East when there were all of these different imperial powers vying for control of the region. And the people who wrote our Hebrew scriptures and Greek scriptures, the Old and New Testaments, we call them, the people who wrote those scriptures lived in this sort of constant conquest and oppression of all these imperial powers around them. If you've attended some of my other things, we did a lot of history talk in other times. We're not going to do a lot of history talk today, but it's important to recognize that in those contexts, worship was everywhere. Worship was a form and structure that shaped everyone's lives and that created your allegiance to different communities and different participation in those communities. Every empire had their own god or set of gods and their own set of values and beliefs, And part of the process of conquest and domination of your neighbor was to destroy or eradicate their gods and their worship and replace them with your own and demand obedience and obeisance to it. So worship was political. I hate to spoil it for you guys, worship has always been political. I know that some people get offended when worship sometimes feels political in the present moment, but it has always, from the very beginning, always been political. It has been an attempt by one culture or community to either enforce their values on another, or an attempt of another culture or community to preserve or hold their values against an opposing force that's attempting to impose them. So for example, if Assyria goes to war against their neighbors, the belief of the ancient Near Eastern period is that just as the people are waging war, the gods are waging war, and the Assyrian gods are waging war against the Babylonian or their other neighbors' gods, and it's a test of whose gods are more powerful and more true and more worthy of worship. And if one side wins, that is deemed to be evidence, that is deemed to be proof that their God is more worthy of worship, it's more powerful than their neighbor's God. And as such, part of the victory is to destroy your enemy's temples and build your own temples on top of their temples, where their temple were, to replace them and enforce the worship of your God in their place. All of these ancient empires practice this. We sometimes talk about religion and as though, I'll get 1 second, Tom. Sometimes talk about religion as though they were, that it's either polytheistic or monotheistic, either you have many gods or you have one God. But in actuality, there's a practice sort of in between this, which is called henotheism, which is a belief that there are various gods, but that your God is the most important or most valuable one. So in other words, in a polytheistic religion, you acknowledge many gods and maybe worship those many gods, or you share in worshiping some groups of them. But in a henotheistic religion, it's a competition, it's a war between the gods, and your God is your God, their God is their God, and those gods are fighting, and you're competing to see which God is the God that comes out on top. All right, Tom, I saw your hand.
Wouldn't you say Persia, under their belief in Zoroastrianism, was different? Zoroastrianism is different, but it also never really was an imperial religion, an official religion of a state in the same way, which is part of the point I'm going to be getting to. Okay.
So, the kinds of religion, go for it.
Is it religiosity that's political or worship that's political?
That is a great question.
That strikes home.
Yeah, it is a broad question. I mean, we can think about that in a couple ways. We could spend a whole morning on it. We can think about that in a couple ways. To a certain degree, one can say that everything is political because politics is just the way human beings organize themselves. That involves everything. That involves food, gender, culture, religion. It involves texts and books that we do and things like that. But I would say that there's another sense in which we talk about politics, which is not just how humans organize themselves, but the concrete expression of power, like how we're trying to enforce our desires and wills on each other. And in that sense, religion isn't necessarily inherently political because religion isn't always involved in the attempt to assert power. Religion can be private, can be something that we just do with ourselves in our communities. Worship, however, because it is public, it always involves some element of a power dynamic. Because worship is groups of people together in public places, involves some amount of power dynamic. Even in our community where we try to be very egalitarian, for example, I get most of the words. I stand up front at a slightly higher spot than the rest of you, and y'all listen to me most of the time, not the other way around. I have been entrusted by the institution with education and resources with a design or intent that it would create an expertise that would be vested in me as part of that. Also though, there's other forms of power that we have in our community that are expressed in worship, which are about the attempt to shape narratives of how we understand the world and what our values are, how we're going to act and behave in the world. So I don't want to go too far down that, but I would say that worship is more or less always, to some degree, political. It can vary, it's a scale, it's not always like maximally political, but there's always some element of power involved in decisions and how we do that.
One quick
Sure.
last thing. But isn't it a form of worship to go into your room and close the door by yourself and get on your knees and pray? Isn't that a form of worship, and you're doing that absolutely individually and not in a group?
That's a good question. Maybe.
Maybe.
Yeah, maybe. I would say, since the idea of something being worthy of your obeisance and acknowledgments, if it only extends to a purely individualized practice, it probably isn't quite worship yet, because the idea of something being worthy is the idea that you're saying, it's an argument. It's like I'm saying to you, you should respect and value this. It's not just me respecting and valuing it, it's me telling you, this is a thing of value, you ought to value it. Which is a step beyond just, if I have something in my heart that I love, but I never ask someone else to love it too, I never say to someone else, I think you should love this thing is worthy of your love, then it's not going to say.
You make it sound like it's a market. Worship is a market.
It seems semantic.
I know. It's
semantics.
There we go. Now this is the challenge when you start to study things in a historical, critical, and an academic sense. It starts to sound cold, and I understand that, especially when something that's like so deep in us emotionally that I'm asking for a little bit of analytical distance on thinking about it. All right. So we've talked about worship being sort of inherently political to some degree, and how it is in this ancient Near Eastern world, there's this competition of the gods. But you'll note that the implication, or what I was describing there, is something at sort of like a macro scale, like zoomed out 30,000 feet. We're talking about empires fighting with each other. Because this form of religion, of what I'm talking about, is really a particular form of religion. It's an imperial form of religion. Now, it was the form of religion that was dominant. It was the most commonly expressed one, and the one that, and to some degree, we've all been influenced by. All of modern religion has been shaped by its history, and the history has been influenced by these empires. So, imperial religion is this form of religion that is this competition between these gods, and this war and this determination of center of value. And who you worship isn't just a matter of internal belief or feeling, it is a matter of allegiance. It's a matter of declaration of your allegiance to a particular group of people. If you worship Marduk, it is because you are Babylonian and you are elevating Babylonian power by worshiping Marduk. If you worship Baal, it is because you are elevating the Assyrian Canaanite element. If you worship Yahweh, it is because you are declaring your allegiance to the people of Israel and that people's cultural power, cultural beliefs, and a set of those things. This is true and even in supposedly sort of tolerant empires like Rome. Rome didn't destroy or replace other gods in the same way that Assyria and Babylon did. But Rome demanded that everyone worship Caesar. So you can worship Isis or, Marduk or whoever you want, but you must also worship Caesar in order to live peacefully within the Roman zone of control as there. So worshiping a particular god it's about allegiance the same way we say declare allegiance to a nation or to a government. There it's a statement of I follow you, or I follow this set of values and beliefs.
I pledge allegiance to the flag.
Absolutely, right. So within this imperial context, there also grew up some counter traditions, because there's always counter traditions. Just as there are dominant cultures, there's always subcultures and resistance movements within those dominant cultures. And among those subcultures and resistance cultures are what I would deem the traditions that became our tradition.
the Hebrew, Jewish, and eventually Christian tradition. And also I would list Zoroastrianism as a counter tradition, as a sub-tradition there. I would list most forms of Buddhism as a form of counter tradition or sub-tradition of resistance to these things. But I don't want to get too much onto world religions and the various ones that are. But what these counter traditions have in common is that they also needed some of the same things that an imperial religion needs. They needed to form group cohesion, they needed allegiance, they needed bonding, they needed a sense of this is our values, this is what we commit to. It was about power still, because even though you're in the subgroup, you have to protect yourself, and you have to protect yourself against a much bigger, more powerful enemy. So you're still trying to figure out who, how we control and keep ourselves safe and things like that. But in these resistance traditions, worship has some slightly different functions. Even though it has some similarities, it's also got some differences. Because in these resistance traditions, we don't have any pretense of conquering all of our neighbors and forcing all of our neighbors to worship our God, nor do we think that is how worship should ultimately function, what worship should ultimately be about. And you can see in our scriptures throughout that it is written by a group of people who were living under these series of imperial conquests and trying to figure out how to survive and thrive and care for each other, and how to not be crushed or absorbed, appropriated into the imperial power structure, and also how to have some belief that there was something beyond the imperial power structure. And so there came this belief, messianic beliefs, or apocalyptic beliefs, or eschatological, which is just a fancy word for end times or heaven sort of beliefs. All of these different forms of belief, which are all of them basically at their core some belief of the idea that this too shall pass, like this period of dominance and oppression is going to end at some point, and beyond that there will be something better. There'll be something more beautiful, more freeing, more loving, and various ways of trying to describe that. It'll be, if it's a messianic belief, it's about a particular savior figure coming and overthrowing the powers of oppression. If it's an apocalyptic belief, it's about lies being exposed, the truth being revealed, and everyone seeing the truth for the final time. If it's an end times or eschatological belief, it's about disasters and collapses, but out of the collapses coming something better and new, after the fact. So all of these different beliefs are about a community within a imperial religious context trying to craft a counter-religion that opposes the imperial religion and tries to keep people within that tradition from just joining up with the imperial religion. It's a noted trait of Judaism that remains true to the present moment, that they have more or less always as a people lived as a minority group among other more powerful groups, and have therefore had to find ways to keep a hold of their culture and religion and tradition, despite the many pressures to just become part of the dominant culture. And so it's sort of woven into the Hebrew Bible, which became as well our Bible, and therefore also woven into the Christian tradition of this sort of don't conform to the world. The New Testament puts it this way: don't conform to the world, don't be like the rest of the world, stand apart, be different from the rest of the world. This is what I mean by this sort of counter-imperial, counter-cultural structure and form of religion. So if these are the two frameworks that are kind of operating in the times that our religions came to be, that Christianity came to be, I want to think about what worship looks like, the practice of worship looks like in these two different groups. So, in an imperial, structure and form of worship,
The goal is like unity, is getting everyone all on to follow the same set of beliefs, and therefore the goal is also like the stirring of emotions toward some feeling of pride or patriotism or belonging, of these sorts of things. So the goal of this year, we're looking for, you know, unity, pride / patriotism. We're looking for obedience. We're looking for perhaps fear or awe of the power. In these sorts of things in the worship structure. So a worship structure in an imperial context, or an imperial structure and form of worship, looks grandiose. It looks triumphal. You know, a worship service in imperial structure rarely is going to be soft or quiet or contemplative, because they're not interested in, or an imperial form of religion isn't interested primarily in developing virtues of like contemplation or humility or thought or critical thinking or individual kind of thinking. They're interested in like everyone being like swept up in the power and the emotion and commitment and you know, driven toward a grandiose direction and cause and end. If the goal is to be like, if you're worshiping Marduk to celebrate the Emperor of Babylon is interested in you being awed and impressed by him and committed to being willing to like do whatever you have to for the empire, you know, to serve and be willing to, if necessary, join the army and engage in violence against your neighbors and foes and so forth, or work in the fields or the building, whatever work the empire needs out of you to become useful to the empire. So it has this,
Dedicated.
Yeah, dedicated, commitment, yeah, dedication, obedience, commitment, dedication. Imperial worship, I mean, inherent to an empire is concept is like hierarchy. So imperial worship is going to be structured in a way that is, the hierarchy is evident. It's going to be structured in a way where like you can see within the worship service itself the power structure that is part of the empire. So imperial worship may separate genders, or it may separate classes and have certain classes of people in different places. It may have, you know, lots of displays of signs of wealth and power and privilege and things like that inside it. Yeah.
But some of these things you're saying is also talking about Judaism too.
So yeah, you're right. When I'm setting up a binary, you almost, anytime someone sets up a binary, you should be like, you should get suspicious, right? Nothing is that simple. There's no such thing as just one pure and one not, right? We are always tempted to engage in this sort of stuff, even when we are part of an otherwise countercultural or counter-imperial tradition. It's always tempting, because this stuff is fun. I mean, it's great. Have you ever been to a 4th of July parade, or have you ever been to a big grandiose celebration with fireworks or something like that? Like, you know, triumphal, celebratory, we're all part of the same thing together, get swept up in how it feels great. Have you ever been to a giant rock concert and it feels like you just all become like one mass of humanity, all connected together by something? Like, this stuff feels good, and it isn't inherently bad, but we can see how what it functions to do is to create large blocks of people headed in the same direction, which is why I'm talking about power and politics, right? Like when you get large groups of people all headed in the same direction, all with sort of committed to obedience and commitment and pride and patriotism and awe, power and hierarchy, you know, like that can be dangerous. Right? And it's everywhere. And it's not only is some of this stuff evident at times and places and practice of Judaism, it's evident in forms of Christianity as well. There are Christian churches where you go into the Christian church and it's like a rock concert, or there's a very clear established hierarchy in the space, or where there's lots of grandiose displays of wealth and such. And absolutely, there have been Christian churches that have been very closely allied with empire. So,
Catholic cathedrals.
so being Christian does not make us immune to imperial thinking, by any means. By any means. Even though I am claiming that historically Christianity arose as an anti-imperial tradition, that doesn't mean that all Christians have been anti-imperial. But in a, liberatory is the word I'm using, liberation or liberationist, liberatory form and structure of religion, worship will, not necessarily have some of the same characteristics. In a liberatory context, worship will often involve contemplation. It will be more, I won't claim it's always purely egalitarian, but it will be more sharing in terms of who takes on different roles at different times. More likely for that to be the case. In a liberatory context, we will also often see, things that want you to engage in thought. So, for example, a sermon is just someone talking. But a sermon is someone talking, on scripture and theology and religion and belief. But that can be done in a variety of different ways. It can be done in a way to, encourage you not to think, and to encourage you to set aside your own ideas and thoughts, and to be subsumed into the thoughts of an authority figure, to be told that this is how you must think, or this is what you're, to be told that this is the only correct way to think. Sermons can also be done more like a lecture or a conversation or an invitation to dialogue, in which case the sermon can be done in a way that is designed to encourage you to have your own thoughts, or to change how you're thinking in ways that are as part of that. Liberatory worship will also have modes of lament or sorrow in addition to the happier modes there. You can't, you'll never go to an imperialist style worship service, you'll never go to a big patriotic event, and at the patriotic event, you'll never have, let's talk about slavery. You'll never go to a thing like this and have someone be like, well, but let's think about all the times that it was really bad for us, unless it's very briefly as a way to celebrate how they're not bad anymore, or they're not going to be, in that way. You're never going to be invited at a imperial style worship service to get sad, which is partly why they're so popular, because people, it's not fun being invited. But at a liberatory service, you will sometimes be invited to think about something that is hard to think about, that is uncomfortable to think about, that makes you sad.
So where does, I hope I got this right, Ramadan?
Yeah,
where does that fit on the scale then?
Ramadan, so I would say that Islam comes from the same, more or less, tradition as Judaism and Christianity. It also is predominantly a coming out of an anti-imperial context like Christianity and Judaism. It has also plenty of times flirted with imperial behaviors. There's no...
So you're saying it's...
Yeah, but it's there. So, but Ramadan is very similar to Jewish feasts of fasting and atonement as well. It's very similar to Yom Kippur. It's a reset of the new year. It's a period of, I think it's 8 days, where you don't eat during the day, where you fast and you only eat at night. And you do that as a way to prepare yourself for being cleansed in the new year of your sins, so you can go into the new year whole and prepared and ready for the new year. So that is, that kind of practice, that sort of penitential practice, I would put down here. Because an invitation to contemplate your sin and to want to be cleansed of sin, that's not a celebration of why we're powerful and great. right? Like that's an invitation to humility. That's an invitation to thinking of as part of it.
But it's a communal thing.
It's a communal thing.
And so this can be communal either way. Okay,
Yeah.
that's what I was not grasping.
Yeah. Again, I love that everyone is asking questions which push back on the binary, because of course, binaries are false. There is not such a thing as a purely imperial religion or a purely liberatory religion. All communities and groups are messy, and we do things. We here, every single week, I tell you about the table where we're going to be equals at this table and what this means, and I do so right now, at least, or have since I've been here, while still standing in front of an American flag. So we're not perfect. Like we're still figuring out how we are going to be together as a community and what that means. We're not trying to set up a good guys versus bad guys situation. What we are trying to do is think about what worship does, how it functions, and what the context of these worship services were like, both in the past and moving into the present. So worship services can be events that are designed to get large groups of people unified around a common cause, to have a shared set of beliefs, and to be willing to follow a power structure so that that power structure can do what it thinks it needs to do. As there. My own sort of like anarchist mindset finds that potentially dangerous, potentially frightening, that worship services can function in that way as there. And obviously, I will tend to think that it's better for worship services to do something else as part of that. And the examples of that include these resistance communities who they didn't have any pretense. Like if you're a Christian in the, around 150 AD, there's, a couple thousand of you in the whole Roman Empire, in an empire of tens of millions, and you have made this crazy commitment. Let's be honest here. It was crazy commitment to potentially getting arrested and persecuted because you refused to do the emperor worship that everyone else around you does. And everyone else does it. And there's lots of them who are like, look, it's not a big deal. You go, you worship Caesar, and then you go and you live your life. And it takes, 30 minutes of your day, once a week or every so often. What are you really complaining about? And in the meantime, hey, at least then the legions leave us alone because we did the thing, and now we can go and do the thing. And Caesar's building roads. He's not a bad guy all the time, right? As part of that. And the Christians are going, but no, because Caesar's building the roads on the backs of slaves and poor people, and he's enforcing his will at the point of a sword with his legions among people who don't want to be part of this, of this empire, and worshiping that God is just one more step down the road to us being part of that violence and that oppression. And so we refuse to be part of that violence, even at the level of, bowing to a statue and saying some words, and doing so. For this community, in that period of time, they need something different from worship. This community here is about, being part of the broader whole, and being able and willing to live in it, and also to do its will. This community here needs something that is going to give them some hope in a very precarious situation. They're going to need something that's going to sustain them when they're in a situation where it's day to day potentially unsafe for them. And so this community is interested in a form of worship that doesn't proclaim false hope along the idea of like, rah, rah, we're better than them, we're gonna win the war, but instead gives them something I would describe as food for the journey, nourishment to sustain in potentially challenging or trying circumstances. And so the Christian worship has been built around, from those early times, because our worship, as we're going to talk about the form of worship after the break, when we talk about what worship is, the origins of that worship and the design of that worship was to get a small group of people together and offer them some solace and some nourishment so that they could then do challenging, difficult work outside the worship context. So the worship service really came to be about, I spent my whole day getting berated by my boss or my landlord because because I'm a minority and they can do that to me. They have power over me, and I'm just trying to, get through another day and keep my kids and my family well, and also still have some hope for the future about this thing. And I need something at this worship service that's going to sustain me, that's going to give me that, what spiritual energy I need, those emotional reserves to be able to get up tomorrow and commit again to do the hard thing. Because it would be super easy. It would be super easy just giving up and going and worshiping Caesar. That would be the easiest thing in the world. If I just did that one time, everybody get off my back, and then it will be there. So I need something that's going to encourage me to keep on to doing the challenging thing in the midst of that. Questions about this sort of presentation of worship styles and formats and how it came to be these two modes? Has anyone got an example of a time that you attended some event, doesn't have to be in a church or a religious place, that you felt fit one of these, that like you would describe it as being like, yeah, that felt like it was this kind of experience?
I think for me, what came up for me, two things. First of all, I have a question. Is it coincidental that some is in red and some is in blue?
Right.
Caught that, but I wasn't going to say anything.
Hey, visual schemas are helpful. They can help us.
Anyway, and then the second thing is, not to pick a side, of course. The second thing is, some of my I'm thinking about, Luis Palau at an Episcopal church in New York City and doing the altar call.
Yeah.
There was some of that, but it was also, it was very contemplative. It was very penitential.
Yeah.
And of course it's in, an Episcopal cathedral with the high, and the big cross and all that.
Yeah.
So it was a combination of things. And there was very contemplative and, kneeling and, solace and things like that. So it was a mix of styles, right, of the two.
Yeah.
And it was memorable.
Yeah, that's it. So that's a beautiful example of how complicated and messy this can all get, because it is. I would say that I find the sort of evangelical, Pentecostal mode of worship, which has risen in America in the 1800s and the Great Awakening, they're super messy for that reason, because it is at times very bottom-up, very grassroots, very egalitarian, very penitential, very how do we resist, don't conform to the world in its mode. The Pentecostals, by the way, were the first in our modern context to ordain women. Before Methodists and Presbyterians were doing it, Pentecostals were ordaining women. So, they were radicals in that way, and good for them. And I get super suspicious of a Billy Graham-like crusade. Even using the word crusade puts me on edge of recognizing this is a potential imperial way of trying to get tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people to all, be part of this vast intentional movement that becomes, quite evidently in our culture, a politicized movement aimed toward particular political objectives. So it's also a potential tool that can be used in this way. So can it be totally contemplative and liberatory in a sense that it's really interested in setting you free from old habits and patterns? How many miraculous stories of people getting free from addictions, getting free from abusive relationships and patterns, behaviors? wonderful things. And then also, can we use this same tool to mobilize a whole large group of people and get them all committed to, achieving some specific political end? Yeah. So
I was thinking of England during the time when Catholicism was kicked out. They tore down their churches, and Protestant came in. I mean, both of those were imperial in England at the same time. I mean, you think about it. I mean, it really was.
Yeah.
And it was like you had to obey and be part of either the Catholics or the Protestants. You had to. And, think about, I mean, it really wasn't the second one.
No.
Mean, for some people individual, but really, the whole churches themselves were imperial.
yeah, right. Yeah. I mean, especially in England where, Henry wanted to divorce his wives, there wasn't grand high motives for wanting to change the churches over. It was pretty, pretty crass political objectives. And then you mentioned the tearing down the churches and this. I think about outbursts of iconoclasm, which is destruction of statues and art and things like that. And it's interesting because displays of wealth and power and privilege are a way to do this. The church having a whole bunch of, gold altars and things like this is a way to do this. It displays hierarchy, it provokes fear, awe, it also can get you to feel pride, patriotism, the grandiosity of it, the amazement. There are some beautiful works of art in churches all over Europe that are just astonishingly beautiful works of art. So it can be used as a way to do this. And so the resistance to it, the iconoclasm, could be seen as an attempt to deconstruct, to get back to simplicity. There's a reason why in America we have so many of these whitewashed, simple churches that have no art inside them. This church is a little bit of an interesting mix in that we put in some stained glass, but we still have the plain white painted walls. So we've got a little bit of that brethren, a little bit of that we're suspicious of beauty and art because it might be a pathway toward this. And yet we're also kind of like, we also like our stained glass, so we have a little bit of little bit of both in there. But if that iconoclasm, if I wanted to put it over here, there, you're right. It was not done in a way that was liberating. It was done in a violent, and not just the act of violence of destroying the statues, but in a people weren't given a choice. It was a mandate that this must be the way. And there's another way of thinking about all of that statues and art, which isn't just about portraying hierarchy, fear, awe, power, things like that. In many cases, the art and statues and things like that for a largely illiterate populace were the primary way of learning their scripture and their stories and their history. It was a primary teaching tool. It was a pedagogical tool for how do we learn about these things among people who aren't literate and don't read scripture. That's another way of thinking about it. And there's still yet another way, and I don't want to get too distracted by it, but that the church in the Middle Ages had a role in preventing state power from getting too out of control by keeping bullion out of circulation. This is going to get into complex geopolitics. I don't want to spend too much time on it. But the church literally actively, the gold in a lot of the church sanctuaries was gold that the church had basically kept out of the hands of princes on purpose. Because if princes had the gold, they used it to raise armies. And so the church would basically say, hey, you're going to hell, prince, unless you give your bullion to us to hold for you so that you can be sanctified and there. And the prince would make the trade of not going to hell in order to not have an army, which the church thought was a pretty okay trade. And the serfs and peasants often thought was a pretty okay trade. Our prince is going to go to heaven, and we don't have to go kill our neighbors. That's an okay deal with us. So there's multiple ways to think about these things. It's not black and white. Nevertheless, I do want you thinking about power, and I do want you thinking about what worship does. What are we doing in worship? Not just the words and stuff, but like what is its function? How is it shaping us? And what is it making us be and do in the world? And is it tending more toward power over, dominance, control? Or is it tending more toward liberation, egalitarian beliefs and structures, freedom for more people? All right, let's take a 5-minute break. Help yourself to any drinks, stretch your legs, anything you want with that, and we'll come back for part 2.